They say art is universal, that it transcends time, space, and gender. But if that were true, why is women's art being tagged inferior to art by men? If you are familiar with the art space or are an artist yourself, you would know that this is true. So do women's art suck? The phrasing alone drips with contempt, as though women's creativity exists only to be judged, doubted, dismissed. And yet, this is not just about whether one painting is better than another, or whether a woman can sculpt with the same genius as a man. The real mystery runs much deeper. To understand it, we need to peel back layers of history, philosophy, and culture, layers that hide a truth about art that most of us were never meant to see. Because here's the secret. The very idea of what counts as art has never been neutral. It was built, constructed, shaped by centuries of men writing the rules, defining the standards, and deciding who gets remembered. To ask if women's art sucks is to already step into a trap, a framework designed long ago to ensure that women, and everything associated with them, would always appear to come up short. But where did this all begin? How did we even come to understand aesthetics as a concept? And more crucially, how did these supposedly objective categories become weapons of exclusion? The origins of what we call fine art stretch back to ancient Greece, where the term techne encompassed both what we now call art and skilled craftsmanship. There was no hierarchy between painting a portrait and weaving a tapestry. Both required techne, both deserved recognition. But something shifted during the Renaissance and crystallized in the 18th century, when philosophers like Kant and Hume tried to codify taste and beauty. They asked, what makes something beautiful? What makes it art? And more importantly, who gets to decide? In their world, the artist was already imagined as male, solitary, rational, disembodied from the messiness of everyday life. The aesthetic experience, they theorized, required what Kant called disinterestedness, a cool, detached contemplation supposedly purged of desire, need, and the physical realities of existence. This wasn't just philosophical abstraction, it was a deliberate architecture of exclusion. Women were cast as muses, as subjects, as inspirations, but not as creators in their own right. Meanwhile, women's actual labor, embroideries, quilts, cooking, singing, lullabies, arranging domestic spaces, was systematically expelled from the newly created realm of fine art. These practices weren't considered art at all. They were craft, domestic, minor. The birth of modern aesthetics carried within it a violent division, a hierarchy that would echo through centuries. Art meant oil on canvas, marble sculptures, grand architecture created for public spaces. Beauty meant something sublime, lofty, transcendent. But weaving, sewing, storytelling in kitchens or marketplaces, that was trivial, functional, not even worth recording in the histories that were being written. Consider what was happening here. The very moment Western culture began to theorize art as a distinct category, it simultaneously created a system of exclusion that mapped perfectly onto gender divisions. The public sphere, where important art happened, was male territory. The private sphere, where women's creative practices flourished, was rendered invisible to aesthetic theory. This wasn't an oversight, it was structural. The concepts of fine art and craft weren't just different categories, they were hierarchical ones, with craft serving as the devalued other against which fine art could define its superiority. And since women's creative work was consistently classified as craft, women were, by definition, incapable of producing real art. The trap was set even more insidiously through the concept of genius. For centuries, the figure of the artist became bound up with the myth of creative genius, a mysterious, divine spark that could not be taught, only bestowed by nature or the gods. Who possessed this genius? Always men. Michelangelo, Da Vinci, Beethoven, Shakespeare. Their genius was presented as self-evident, shining above the mundane world of ordinary mortals. But when women produced extraordinary work, critics and historians rushed to explain it away. It was luck, imitation, craft skill rather than creative vision. Or worse, merely sentimental expression rather than intellectual achievement. Genius, they insisted with the confidence of natural law, was fundamentally incompatible with femininity. This wasn't accidental. Christine Battersby's meticulous historical research reveals how the romantic conception of genius in the 18th and 19th centuries became explicitly gendered. The artistic genius was praised not only for intellectual brilliance, traditionally coded as masculine, but also for a sensitivity and emotional depth that borrowed heavily from supposedly feminine qualities. Yet this appropriation came with a cruel twist. While male artists could embody both rationality and sensitivity, becoming complete creative beings, actual women were denied this synthesis. Their emotions were dismissed as mere nature, their sensitivity as biological inevitability rather than artistic choice. The genius was imagined as a kind of artistic hermaphrodite, capable of transcending gender limitations, but only if he was biologically male. Women, trapped in their natural femininity, could never achieve this transcendence. The language used to describe this phenomenon is revealing. 19th century critics routinely employed metaphors of pregnancy, gestation, and birth to describe male artistic creativity. The male genius conceived ideas, labored over them, and gave birth to masterpieces. As Battersby documents, the metaphors of male motherhood became commonplace, as did those of male midwifery. The artist conceived, was pregnant, labored in sweat and pain, was delivered, and in an uncontrolled ecstasy of agonized male control brought forth. Meanwhile, when women actually gave birth or created domestic objects or nurtured families, this was considered mere biological function, not creative achievement. Men got the metaphorical credit for creation while women's actual creative labor remained invisible. But the philosophical architecture of exclusion didn't stop with genius. It invented aesthetic categories, the beautiful and the sublime, that carried their own gendered payload. Edmund Burke's influential treatise established beauty as bounded, small, delicate, smooth, qualities he explicitly associated with the fair sex. The sublime, by contrast, was vast, rough, terrifying, unlimited, associated with masculine power and intellectual vigor. This wasn't merely descriptive, it was prescriptive. Women were locked into the realm of the beautiful, which was simultaneously praised and diminished. Beautiful objects were pleasant, decorative, charming, but never world-changing. They couldn't access the sublime experiences that supposedly marked the highest forms of art and aesthetic experience. Kant's aesthetic theory, perhaps the most influential in Western philosophy, deepened this exclusion. In his observations on the feeling of the beautiful and sublime, he argued that women possessed beautiful minds, but were constitutionally incapable of appreciating sublimity. They lacked the intellectual strength and moral character necessary for sublime experience. This wasn't presented as cultural conditioning or educational limitation. It was offered as natural fact. Women could appreciate pretty things, but they could never access the profound transcendent experiences that defined the highest reaches of aesthetic and moral development. The implications were staggering. If art at its best evoked the sublime, and if women were constitutionally barred from sublime experience, then women could neither create nor fully appreciate the greatest art. They were permanently relegated to a minor league of aesthetic experience, capable of producing pleasant decorative objects, but incapable of the serious business of transforming human consciousness through art. The entire philosophical framework made women's aesthetic inferiority appear to be a law of nature rather than a political arrangement. This framework also relied on what feminist philosophers would later identify as a series of hierarchical dualisms: mind over body, reason over emotion, universal over particular, culture over nature, public over private. In each case, the first term was valorized and associated with masculinity, while the second was devalued and linked to femininity. Art that engaged the body, expressed emotion, emerged from particular experiences, or operated in domestic spaces was automatically classified as inferior. The aesthetic theory that claimed to be universal and objective was actually a sophisticated justification for existing power relations. The consequences for women artists were devastating. Those who did manage to create despite institutional barriers found their work systematically misinterpreted, minimized, or erased. Artemisia Gentileschi, whose paintings demonstrated technical mastery and psychological complexity that rivaled any of her male contemporaries, was reduced for centuries to the rape victim painter, as though her artistic significance could only be understood through her trauma rather than her achievement. Her powerful depictions of biblical heroines like Judith beheading Holofernes were read as personal revenge fantasies rather than sophisticated engagements with themes of justice, power, and female agency. Similarly, Hilma af Klint, who created abstract paintings years before Kandinsky, Mondrian, or any of the men typically credited with inventing abstraction, was written out of art history entirely. Her work remained hidden until the late 20th century. Not because it lacked quality or innovation, but because the institutional structures of the art world had no framework for recognizing a woman as a pioneering abstract artist. When her work finally received attention, critics scrambled to explain why her innovations didn't count. She was influenced by spiritualism, they claimed, rather than serious artistic theory. Her abstractions were intuitive rather than intellectual, mystical rather than rational. The very categories used to diminish her work revealed the gendered assumptions underlying art historical judgment. But women artists weren't passive victims of these systems. They developed strategies of resistance, alternative networks, and counter-narratives that challenged aesthetic orthodoxy from within. The salon culture of 18th and 19th century Europe, often organized by women, provided spaces where different kinds of aesthetic conversation could flourish. Women writers like George Eliot and Charlotte Bronte didn't just produce novels, they theorized about art, aesthetics, and creativity in ways that implicitly challenged masculine assumptions about genius and creative authority. The 20th century brought explicit feminist challenges to these aesthetic foundations. Lyndon Knocklin's groundbreaking 1971 essay, "Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists?" didn't just document women's exclusion from art history. It exposed the ideological structures that made such exclusion seem natural. The problem wasn't that women lacked talent or ambition, but that the entire system of artistic education, patronage, exhibition, and historical preservation was designed to prevent women from developing and displaying their capabilities. The question itself, why no great women artists, revealed more about the questioner's assumptions than about women's abilities. Noxton's analysis sparked a broader feminist rethinking of aesthetic categories. If the concept of fine art systematically excluded women's creative practices, then perhaps the concept itself was the problem. Feminist theorists began questioning the hierarchical distinction between art and craft, high and low culture, aesthetic and functional objects. They asked, why should embroidery be considered less artistic than painting, when both require technical skill, creative vision, and aesthetic judgment? Why should cooking be excluded from discussions of creativity, when it involves composition, color, texture, and the orchestration of complex sensory experiences? Why should the design of living spaces, the creation of environments that shape daily experience, be dismissed as mere decoration rather than recognized as a fundamental aesthetic practice? This questioning led to a broader critique of the mind-body dualism that had structured Western aesthetics. If aesthetic experience was supposed to be purely mental, detached from physical desire and bodily need, then how could it account for arts that were explicitly embodied? What about dance, which made the moving body its primary medium? What about performance art, which used the artist's physical presence as material? What about crafts like pottery or weaving, where the maker's hands directly shape the final work? The disembodied aesthetic subject that Kantian theory imagined, coolly contemplating objects from a distance, began to seem less like a philosophical ideal than a specifically masculine fantasy of control and separation. Feminist artists of the 1960s and 70s didn't just critique these theories, they exploded them through practice. Their work refused to stay within the boundaries that traditional aesthetics had established. Judy Chicago's The Dinner Party reclaimed the table as a site of historical memory and female achievement. The work used techniques traditionally associated with women's craft, ceramic sculpture, embroidery, painted porcelain, to create a monumental installation that demanded to be taken as seriously as any masculine monument. The vaginal imagery that Chicago incorporated wasn't just provocative, it was a direct challenge to the disembodied aesthetic that had excluded women's physical reality from art. Performance and body art pushed these challenges even further. Carolee Schneemann's interior scroll, in which she pulled a text from her vagina while reading about women's exclusion from art, confronted audiences with the female body not as object to be contemplated, but as subject capable of speech, thought, and artistic authority. The piece violated every rule of traditional aesthetics. It was explicitly sexual, politically confrontational, temporally bounded, and impossible to collect or commodify. It existed only in the moment of performance and in the documentation that followed. By making her body both the medium and the message, Schneemann collapsed the distinction between artist and artwork, creator and creation that had structured Western aesthetic theory. Anna Mendietta's Earth Body works, created during the 1970s, challenged aesthetic boundaries in different ways. Her Silhouetta series, which involved carving body-shaped impressions into landscapes and filling them with flowers, blood, fire, or earth, refused the traditional separation between art and nature, culture and landscape. The works existed temporarily, documented through photography but designed to decay and disappear. They couldn't be bought, sold, or displayed in galleries. They existed at the intersection of sculpture, performance, photography, and environmental art, creating new categories rather than fitting into existing ones. These practices weren't just expanding the definition of art, they were challenging the entire framework of aesthetic judgment. How do you evaluate a performance that exists only once? How do you compare an earthwork that's designed to decompose with a marble sculpture built to last forever? How do you apply traditional criteria of beauty, form, and composition to works that are explicitly about process, temporality, and political intervention? The feminist art of this period forced critics and historians to develop new vocabulary, new methods of analysis, and new ways of understanding what art could be and do. But the feminist challenge to aesthetics extended far beyond the art world proper. One of the most radical insights of feminist aesthetic theory was the recognition that aesthetic experience doesn't happen only in galleries and concert halls, it's woven into the fabric of daily life. The way a room is arranged, the care taken in preparing and presenting food, the attention to color and texture in clothing choices, the cultivation of gardens, the decoration of bodies, all of these involve aesthetic judgment, creative decision-making, and the construction of meaningful environments. This recognition exploded the traditional boundary between art and life, creation and consumption, aesthetic and practical activity. It suggested that aesthetic experience was far more democratic and widespread than elite theories had imagined, but it also revealed how the devaluation of domestic and everyday aesthetics functioned as a form of class and gender oppression. By defining art as something that happened only in specialized institutions, traditional aesthetics rendered invisible the creative labor that women, working-class people, and marginalized communities invested in making life beautiful, meaningful, and sustaining. Contemporary feminist aesthetics has expanded these insights in multiple directions, recognizing that women's experiences of oppression are complicated by race, class, sexuality, nationality, and other factors. The work of artists and theorists like bell hooks, Trin Min Ha, and Chela Sandoval has shown how feminist aesthetic theory needs to account for the ways that different women experience marginalization differently. A white middle-class woman's exclusion from art institutions operates differently than a working-class woman of color's exclusion, and aesthetic theories need to be sophisticated enough to address these differences without losing sight of shared patterns of oppression. Transnational feminist aesthetics has pushed even further, challenging the assumption that Western categories of art and beauty should be universal standards. What happens when we take seriously indigenous aesthetic traditions that don't separate art from ceremony, or African traditions that integrate visual, musical, and dance elements in ways that resist Western categorization? What about Asian aesthetic philosophies that never developed the same mind-body dualism that structured European thought? These perspectives don't just add diversity to existing frameworks, they reveal the limitations and cultural specificity of what had been presented as universal aesthetic truths. The development of post-colonial and decolonial aesthetic theories has shown how European aesthetic categories were tools of cultural imperialism, used to dismiss non-European creative traditions as primitive or decorative, rather than properly artistic. The same hierarchical thinking that excluded women's domestic arts from serious consideration also excluded entire cultural traditions from recognition as legitimate art. The feminist challenge to aesthetic hierarchy thus connects with broader movements for cultural decolonization and the recognition of multiple, equally valid ways of understanding creativity, beauty, and meaning-making. Digital technologies have opened new frontiers for feminist aesthetic practice, allowing artists to explore questions of identity, embodiment, and virtual reality in ways that earlier generations couldn't imagine. Cyber-feminist artists like VNS Matrix and Legacy Russell have used digital media to experiment with post-gender identities and challenge biological determinism. Their work suggests that technology might offer tools for transcending some of the binary categories, male-female, mind-body, nature-culture, that feminist theorists have identified as oppressive. But technology also raises new questions about access, representation, and control. Who gets to participate in digital culture? How do existing inequalities get reproduced in virtual spaces? How do we prevent technological tools from reinforcing rather than challenging oppressive structures? Contemporary feminist aesthetic theory has to grapple with these questions while remaining attentive to the insights developed through decades of feminist critique. The current moment presents both opportunities and challenges for feminist aesthetics. On one hand, there's greater recognition than ever before of women's contributions to art history, more women in positions of cultural authority, and more sophisticated theoretical frameworks for understanding the intersection of aesthetics and politics. Major museums have committed to diversifying their collections and exhibitions. Art history textbooks have been revised to include previously excluded artists, and feminist aesthetic theory has influenced fields ranging from architecture to fashion design. On the other hand, many of the structural inequalities that feminist aesthetics identified remain intact. Women artists still face discrimination in galleries, auction houses, and critical establishment. The work of women of color, queer women, working-class women, and women from the global south continues to be marginalized. The aesthetic hierarchies that privilege certain forms of expression over others haven't disappeared. They've just become more subtle and harder to challenge directly. Perhaps most importantly, the fundamental question that sparked feminist aesthetics: how do power relations shape what we recognize as beautiful, meaningful, or artistically significant? Remains urgent. In an era of social media, influencer culture, and algorithm-driven content recommendation, the politics of aesthetic judgment have become more complex but no less important. Who decides what images circulate widely? What aesthetic standards are built into the platforms that mediate much of contemporary cultural exchange? How do economic interests shape what kinds of aesthetic experiences are available to different communities? So let's return to the beginning. Does women's art suck? The question assumes that there's some mutual, objective standard by which art can be measured, a standard that women's work consistently fails to meet. But feminist aesthetic theory has shown us that there are no neutral standards, only different frameworks that privilege different values, experiences, and ways of making meaning. The standards that have historically been used to judge art, disinterested contemplation, transcendent genius, formal innovation divorced from social context, weren't discovered through careful investigation of aesthetic phenomena. They were constructed to serve particular interests and maintain particular power relations. This doesn't mean that all aesthetic judgments are equally valid or that we can't distinguish between more and less successful works of art. It means that aesthetic evaluation always happens within frameworks that can and should be examined, questioned, and revised. The feminist challenge to traditional aesthetics hasn't eliminated the possibility of aesthetic judgment. It's made such judgment more honest, more inclusive, and more attentive to the political dimensions of cultural value. Women's art doesn't suck. What sucks is the system that taught us to ask this question in the first place, a system that defined art in ways that excluded women's experiences and creative practices, then used women's exclusion as evidence of their inferiority. The real mystery isn't whether women can make art as well as men. The mystery is why it took so long to recognize that women had been making art all along, in forms and contexts that the dominant culture had trained itself not to see. The revolution in aesthetic theory that feminism has prompted isn't just about including more women in existing institutions, it's about fundamentally reimagining what art can be, what aesthetic experience involves, and who gets to participate in the ongoing creation of cultural meaning. For centuries, women have been creating, painting, weaving, sculpting, designing, storytelling, singing, dancing, cooking, gardening, decorating, performing, not as exceptions to some natural order, but as participants in the fundamental human activity of making life meaningful, beautiful, and sustaining. The tradition is as old as humanity itself. What's new is our willingness to recognize it as such and to build aesthetic theories sophisticated enough to account for the full range of human creative possibility.